Another key consideration in a 3D program is the shading mode or the display mode of a particular view. And as you can see here, by default, the perspective view is shown in a solid or shaded mode here. But the orthographic or 2D views are shown in wireframe. We don't see the actual surface of the object, we just see the lines that make up the object. Of course, we can change the shading mode in any viewport at any time. To make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to create a ground plane. I'm going to select these spheres that I made earlier, grab the Move tool, and just pull those up a little bit so they're above the ground. Do that in the front view as well. And dolly back a little bit here with the mouse wheel in the perspective view, and create a ground plane. Go to the Create panel, Standard Primitives, Plane, click on that and just draw out a plane. Release the mouse, and then right-click to complete that plane creation mode. I'm currently in the Move tool. To exit the Move tool, I press the Q key, and now I'm in Select Object. And as you can see here, we're getting shadows. Let me maximize this view. I'll use the keyboard shortcut, which is Alt-W. And we can orbit around here, Alt and middle mouse. And you can see that those shadows actually stay put. What we're seeing right now is default lighting. There's a light that's currently attached to the perspective camera. We can't see that camera. It's not an object that we can select. It's sort of an implicit object that's always there. And the same goes for the light that's attached to the camera. This is default lighting. Right now, we're in the default mode, which is called realistic mode. And right now, I'm not having any issue with realistic mode. It's looking fine. However, sometimes if you have a heavy scene with a lot of geometry or you got a lot going on, then realistic mode can slow down your computer. And what you can do is then just knock the quality down to so-called shaded mode. Up here in each viewport, on the third of these three buttons, these text labels here, is the mode of the current viewport. We're currently in realistic mode. If I click on that, I can choose a different mode, such as shaded. And that's a much simpler mode that's going to be much faster. And you're not going to have as many performance issues. But of course, it doesn't look as good. We don't get shadows or lighting. Another mode you'll use a lot is, of course, wireframe. Choose wireframe, and now we're just seeing the edges and lines of things. There's a very common keyboard shortcut that lets you switch between wireframe and shaded mode, and that is F3 or function 3. If I press F3, that takes me to realistic. Press F3 again, takes me to wireframe. F3, very important. Switch over to shaded view, F3, and F3 again takes me back to shaded mode that time. So you see, F3 remembers what mode you were in the last time you pressed F3, whether it's realistic or shaded. Another one that's really helpful is showing so-called edged faces. You can go back up here and you will see edged faces is an option. If we turn that on, what we get is in a shaded or realistic view, we get the wireframes drawn on top of the shading. And it doesn't matter whether the object is selected or not, we get to see those wires. That's really helpful when you're trying to analyze a scene because we can see the structure of the objects here with edged faces turned on. And there's a keyboard shortcut for that too, which is F4. We'll toggle edged faces on and off. Okay, so those are the primary modes you need to know. If we go back to realistic mode, then we go back into this dialog, you will see there's some options for lighting and shadows. Currently, we don't have any scene lights. We haven't created any lights. So even though scene lights is enabled, what we're actually getting is default lights. So if you have no real lights in your scene, then you will get default lights. But here we can also turn off things like turn off the shadows or turn off something called ambient occlusion. Let me hit F4 so we can see the ambient occlusion a little bit better. Basically, it's a contact shadow effect. We get a little bit of shading here where objects are really close together, but it's going to really slow down performance. So we can turn that off too. We can go into realistic lighting and shadows and turn off ambient occlusion. And now we're actually getting something very similar to shaded mode. It's just a little bit higher quality than shaded mode. We're in realistic mode with default lighting, no shadows, and no ambient occlusion. Or I could opt to go back and turn the cast shadows back on again. And then finally, there are a bunch of really cool stylized modes in here. And things that you would use kind of rarely but could be really helpful, like facets. So that's going to disable any gradient shading. Normally with 3D objects, we get some gradient applied across these hard edges so that the object looks curved, even though it's made out of all straight lines. Another good one is hidden line, which is like wireframe, except that the wires that are on the other sides of objects, on the back faces, or wires that are hidden behind other objects or occluded, are all cropped off so we don't see them. That's the hidden line mode. And in hidden line, it's not really optimal in terms of the color scheme unless you actually select the object. Back in our dialog here, we've got clay. So this is one of those sort of stylized views. And then most interesting here are these truly stylized ones that are interactive. In the viewport here, we can do sort of like a technical drawing look here by choosing graphite. And that's actually interactive. And so we can tumble around. Not something you use every day, but it's very cool. And in fact, you can render things this way too. We can use ink modes and have a lot of fun with this. Generally though, most of the time, you're going to be in shaded mode because that's going to be the one that's going to give you the best performance. Those are all the various display modes in 3ds Max.